Hi, everyone. Welcome. So nice to have you back. How's everybody doing?
Doing good, doing good.
Great. Waldo, love your background as always.
Very SoCal.
Yes. Hi, Mia. All right. Well, it's great to have you all here. We're really excited to be in our third week of the Academy. I can't believe it. It's gone by so fast, and we hope you've enjoyed it. So just as a quick recap, we started talking about some of the basics relating to our child welfare system. David Noble gave us a great talk about the historical connection that foster care has with slavery, with other forms of racism, and the biases that continue to impact our child welfare system. From there, we moved on to a great talk in reference to some of the mental health issues that impact our kids and our families. We then heard from Jill Rowland speaking about education and its role in our child welfare system and the ways in which our kids involved in child welfare are impacted by our education system and its struggles. And then we heard from a couple of our friends who work on some of the more nuanced issues in child welfare around adoption and LGBTQ plus youth and their unique needs. And we are winding down now with a talk about policy and about reforms in our system. It may have occurred to you over the last 2 weeks that there are quite a few problems, challenges, areas in need of improvement, things that should change in child welfare. And the question you might have is, how do we make that change? Who do we talk to? Where do we go? What types of options do we even have when it comes to implementing that change? And then we will end our academy on Thursday with a talk about careers in child welfare and where you might fit in. But before that, we're really excited to welcome Sue Abrams from the Children's Law Center to talk about policy making, policy and systems reform, and hopefully answer some of those questions about where do we go to fix problems? Who do we talk to when things aren't working? What can we change and how? And what systems and forms of government might we work through in order to do that? Sue is a superior expert in this space. She's also an incredible friend, and the Children's Law Center is a great, great partner of ours at the UCLA Pritzker Center. So we are so happy to have her today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sue. Let's all give her a warm welcome and thank her for being with us today. Go ahead, Sue.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. My husband is a professor and teaching classes at UCLA right now as we speak in the other room. So he was very excited that I was doing this morning. So I'm going to be talking to you about policymaking in the world of child welfare. I am the Director of Policy and Training at Children's Law Center of California. And just a little background on Children's Law Center, which we also call CLC. So we are the largest nonprofit child law firm in the nation. And the reason we're the largest is because LA County has the largest population of youth and non-minor dependents under the jurisdiction of the Dependency Court. We also represent the kids in foster care in Placer and Sacramento. So we kind of have a large, small, and medium county. And we represent in total about now 30,000 youth. So it was 35,000, but in general, the population of youth in care is going down. I think there's been a lot of focus on trying to strengthen families and prevent the need to separate families, which is a really good trend. And so we're seeing kind of that statewide trend of the population of youth in care going down. And CLC has a pretty strong presence in the legislative arena. So almost all of what we do is serve as court-appointed counsel. And you're going to be hearing from another one of our attorneys at the next panel, so I won't talk too much about kind of the day-to-day job for a CLC attorney, but most of what we do is direct service. We have a very small policy unit with a few attorneys and myself who focus on kind of the macro level policy change, system change. And we started this work in 1999, and since then we've successfully sponsored over 40 pieces of legislation. That's awesome. We have someone in the audience who is an intern for us. Okay, so what is child welfare reform? So it's not really a defined thing. This is my own definition, just because I have to often explain to people what I do, and it's a really niche area with not many people doing this kind of work. But I often describe myself as a nonprofit paid lobbyist for kids in the child welfare system. And what we do is try to change or improve the laws or policies that have a direct benefit on the children and families served by child welfare. And this work can be accomplished at the local level, state level, and at the federal level. And just to give you kind of an overview of some of our bigger bills that we've sponsored in the past. So going all the way back to 2003, one of our earlier bills established a right for children in care to participate in age-appropriate extracurricular activities. Seems pretty basic. But lots of times, in order for kids to be able to participate in extracurricular activities, they had to go to court and get a court order. They had to get a court order for funding to be able to participate in a sports program. And so I think, we really just wanted to establish some normalcy and access to regular age-appropriate activities. And so this bill was passed in 2003. And I can tell you, we are now almost 20 years later and still have not implemented this bill. So I have a slide coming up about implementation and how important that is in doing any system reform, because it's actually not as hard to change laws or change policies, but really seeing that change on the ground is where we struggle. In 2005, California created the ability to reverse a termination of parental rights. So we had clients where the family didn't reunify and the plan was adoption. And so they terminated parental rights, but then the child was never adopted and the child was legal orphan. And so California created a process to reverse termination of parental rights. We were the first state to do anything like that. And a few years ago, federal law also created that option. So I think we were really trendsetting in that area. One of the biggest bills, and we worked with many other co-sponsors, was extending foster care up to age 21. And that was in 2010. And then our last few, an area we focused a lot on in the last few years has been addressing some of the barriers to placement with relatives. So oftentimes we see barriers that are rooted in racism or poverty, like relatives can't have a criminal history, they can't have prior referrals to the child welfare system, they need to have enough space for all of the kids to be living with two to a room, and siblings who are the same gender can't be in the same room together, and all these kind of restrictions, licensing restrictions that they apply to relatives that oftentimes were having a disparate impact on families of color. And so we've been spending a lot of our time in recent years trying to address some of those barriers. We worked with David Noble on our last bill on SB 354. So it's really been, we've seen a lot of success in this area, and seeing it play out in the court is awesome. I've gotten a lot of good feedback from our attorneys that there are relatives who've effectively been caring for these kids, but haven't been able to have them placed in their home. And so that's an area that we focus a lot on. This just kind of gives you an idea of the scope of issues that we look at. So where do we begin in making system reform? So the first thing is to recognize the issue. And how do we do that? So this is what we do at CLC. We start to identify patterns in our work. And there's several small policy organizations throughout the state, but I think I always say I have the best job because I have the benefit of working with attorneys who are directly in court. So they can come back from a hearing and say, hey, this law really needs to be changed, or we're starting to see this trend and we really need legislation to help stop it or change it. We also talk to other advocates and organizations. We look at data. And then most importantly, we have to listen to our clients, listen to the youth we serve, and hear what they think is wrong with the system. So that's kind of the start of any child welfare reform, is recognizing the issue. And I know that you guys are on week 3 and have had several people come and speak to you about child welfare. And it sounds like some of you've done internships. So just if anybody is willing to share, would love to hear what your ideas are, how you think the system can be improved from what you know so far. You're welcome to take yourself off mute and share it with me, or write it in the chat if you have any ideas.
Hi, I have an idea. So I actually have questions about this, but I've noticed a trend in visitations with biological parents being cut short due to the child crying or having an emotional response that's really strong. And I think that's really a lack of trauma-informed care. And I'm wondering if there's any policies addressing that currently, or if that's something that I can try to make happen.
That is really a great idea. And it's not dissimilar to something that we've been working on recently, which is that visitation is being used as like a, either as a, so it's being used almost as punishment if our clients are not acting appropriately. So it's used as a threat, like, oh, you're not going to be able to visit if you don't follow our program or if you don't behave. Rather than kind of recognizing that visitation is one of the main key components of reunification and is such an important part of the child welfare system and the goals of the system. And we also see lots of reports come in where you see kind of similar language used, like the child was very emotional after the visit, the child was behaving badly after the visit, as a way to make it seem that that there's like an issue between the child and the parent, instead of recognizing that those emotions and that behavior might come from the fact that they miss their parent and they want to be with their parent, and the visitation is bringing up a whole lot of emotions. And so I think that's a really good point. I think there's probably policy out there that talks about when you can cut a visit short, and it's probably a little vague about what the child's reaction and response is, and if it seems traumatic to the child or something like that. And so maybe that policy can be improved to make sure it's more trauma informed, and to describe that there's probably an expectation that the child's going to be emotional when they're seeing a parent who they've been separated from. So I think that's a really great idea, and thank you for bringing that up. And I will actually look into the policy and see what's there.
Thank you so much. And is that something I could follow up with you to see
You
if there's
definitely
a bill
can.
number or something? Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any
Gabriella,
other
do you want
ideas?
to tell Sue where you're working right now, what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a Pritzker Center Law Fellow, and I'm paired with the Alliance for Children's Rights. And so I'm a law clerk there on the policy team. So I'm really interested
awesome.
in this.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you're working with Kristen?
Yes.
Awesome.
Kristen and Sabrina and David, and Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways we can tackle something like that. So should definitely follow up.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other ideas from anyone? Okay. So moving on from the idea, finding the issue, recognizing the problem, figuring out a solution. And I think this is probably one of the hardest pieces of child welfare reform, because we can identify lots and lots and lots of problems, and have identified lots and lots of problems, but trying to figure out how to resolve the problem is really, I think, the crux of what we do. And so that is just something, there's lots of different ways to tackle an issue. And so you take each problem and really think about it. And I'm going to just go through an example of what we're working on now, so you can kind of see our process. And this is going to be about mandated reporting. So up here, I have the kind of general law in California around mandated reporting. It comes from the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. And you can see this is a series of laws. I only am quoting pieces of it to give you an idea of what it looks like in California. But you can see here what it says: a mandated reporter shall make a report to an agency. So this is to a child welfare agency. They're cross-referencing another section, but a mandated reporter shall make a report to a child welfare agency whenever the mandated reporter, in the mandated reporter's professional capacity or within the scope of the mandated reporter's employment, has knowledge of or observes a child whom the mandated reporter knows or reasonably suspects has been the victim of child abuse or neglect. So that makes sense. If a mandated reporter is aware of possible abuse or neglect, then they are instructed to call the child welfare agency or the police department. So those are the two agencies specified in that other section. So who's a mandated reporter? So this is just part of the list: a teacher, an instructional aide, a teacher's aide, classified employee of a public school. So those all make sense, right? Kind of people who are frequently interacting directly with children. But in California, over time, it's been, the list has been expanded and expanded and expanded, and now goes up to 49. You can see a commercial computer technician, an athletic coach, a person licensed by a FFA. So lots of people are mandated reporters. And I would say almost every single year that I've been doing policy work, there's been bills to expand this list even more. So we have a huge expansive list of people who fall under this criteria of mandated reporters. What needs to be reported? So the law goes into examples of things that need to be reported: sexual abuse, emotional abuse, general neglect, which is what I'm going to focus on today, serious neglect, harming or injuring a child, production of child porn, all things that you would want to be reported to be investigated for abuse or neglect. And you're welcome to stop me at any point if you have questions. I'm just kind of going over background right now. Okay, what else does the law say? A mandated reporter who fails to report an incident of known or reasonably suspected child abuse or neglect is guilty of a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months confinement in county jail or a fine of $1,000 or both. So not only are they mandated by law to report this, but there's also criminal liability if they don't report it. Now let's go back to what the definition is of general neglect. So this is in the mandated reporter laws. General neglect means the negligent failure of a person having care or custody of a child to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision where no physical injury to the child has occurred. So that's our current definition of general neglect that requires a report by a mandated reporter. So my question for you all is, what could possibly go wrong with the current structure of our laws around mandated reporting? Now that I've just kind of walked you through some of the background, I would love people to jump in with some ideas of what could possibly be wrong with the current laws in mandated reporting. Anyone have any ideas from that background or thoughts?
I would like to share. I think people are going to be so scared of getting those negative consequences that they're going to err on the side of caution and possibly over-report.
Right, definitely. And that definition is so broad that it really encompasses a definition of poverty, if you really think about it, right? There's no injury to the child. We're talking about not adequate food, clothing, shelter. What does that mean? So I think that's really kind of the concern, is that the laws can lead to over-reporting. And I think that's what the data is starting to show. And there's a lot of focus on this issue right now. Lots of researchers looking at it. But here is some consequences. And I cited at the bottom the 3 places where this data came from. And all of these are linked, Taylor. So maybe we can send this out. Bias, Jessica wrote bias. Exactly. That's it. Taylor, if you could send these out after, maybe then people can have these links. So both national data and California data are clear that children of color, and especially Black children, are disproportionately reported to child welfare agencies. half of Black children in California, half of Black children, as well as half of Native American children, experience a CPS investigation at some point during the first 18 years of their lives, compared to nearly a quarter of white children. So more than double. You are more than twice as likely, if you're a Black child, to be reported to CPS for an investigation. Similarly, children born to young moms are also disproportionately likely to be reported. The considerable majority of these reports involve allegations of neglect. So we did go over that definition of general neglect, not abuse. And most of these reports are deemed unfounded after an investigation. So lots and lots of oversight and investigations, but most of these reports are deemed unfounded. So there's some data on the investigation itself being very traumatic for families. So you're closely watched, you have someone come to your door, you have someone watching your kids, you have someone taking your kids' clothes off and checking for bruises. And oftentimes the social worker who comes is accompanied by the police. It can be a really traumatic experience for families, especially families who already have trauma interactions with some of these systems. And then there's also some interesting data that talks about how families distance themselves from other support networks after they've been involved in a child welfare investigation. So they might be less likely to seek help from the healthcare system or education or social services because they've been through this child welfare investigation and had somebody overseeing their family in their home. And also, researchers worry that casting such a wide net means that social workers can't focus on the cases that really do need intervention. And oftentimes what we hear about in the public are the very tragic cases where a child's been severely abused or potentially killed in a home, and the social workers didn't do the right investigation, were notified and didn't come in and didn't separate the family when they should have, or protect the child when they should have. And I think there's a concern that, if they're being inundated with calls by mandated reporters, they actually can't focus on the cases that really do need the support from the child welfare system. And just to give you an idea of numbers, I think LA County gets something like 250,000 calls a year. Is that right, Taylor? Yeah, I think it's something like 250,000. And because I was just looking at this data, and then 100,000 of those calls are actually rise to the level of having an investigation where someone goes out. But that is a huge number of calls. And then when you have the vast majority of those being unsubstantiated or unfounded, it means that we're using a lot of resources to go into people's homes and investigate them, causing trauma for their family where they didn't actually need that intervention, and potentially missing out on important cases. So there's a lot of potential negative consequences for the way the law is currently structured. I'm just going to stop there to see if anyone has any questions or thoughts. Okay, and there's a lot more even to go into, like the training. There's not consistent training for mandated reporters. Some of the mandated reporters are just totally outside the scope of regularly working with kids. And so who knows where they're getting this mandated reporter trainings. Even last year, the list expanded to include volunteers at youth organizations, which could be parents, it could be anybody. But now we have even a whole host of other people who, again, are being told, like, if you don't make this report, you're criminally liable. So everybody is going to err on the side of make the report, right? You even hear, like in the news, after someone reports on a really tragic case, if you see something, say something. Like there's, people aren't really thinking about the negative consequences of reporting somebody. They're thinking, I'm doing my job and I'm meeting my obligation, and not really thinking about how it might play out in a negative way. So I have two comments. Mia wrote, I currently live in the Antelope Valley, and this is such an important conversation in our community. I wholeheartedly agree. We represent all the kids in Lancaster and have a satellite court there and are aware of the issues there. Jessica, is there differentiating data on outcomes or approaches between a consultation call versus a specific report from a mandated reporter? Can you expand on what you mean by a consultation call? Because there's now I think there's now an option for mandated reporters to call a number to consult about whether or not they should make a mandated report. Is that what you're referring to, Jessica?
Correct. I think a couple months ago I had to make a call myself, and I did a consultation call, and it was a licensed social worker. So you give the information and that social worker decides whether or not to proceed. So that's what I was wondering, if there was any differentiating data on those types.
That's a really good question. What field are you in? If you don't mind me asking.
I'm in special education, so I work with usually mild to moderate students, but the last year I worked with moderate to severe students.
Okay. So that's an interesting question, and I think something that we should tease out, and I'm writing down your guys' ideas because I'm learning from you as well. We should tease out with DCFS to see if they're tracking those cases. My guess is they aren't, but to see if they're tracking those cases and if they're seeing a different outcome when mandated reporters are using that consultation line before they decide to make a report. So I don't have the answer to that, but I will definitely follow up.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, let me keep looking in the chat. Oh, so Taylor's putting in some numbers. 800 to 1,000 calls to DCFS daily, 50% drop when school closed. So it's gone up, but not to the point it was pre-pandemic. And just to give you I didn't put all of the data in here, but to give you an idea of who's making the calls are predominantly coming from law enforcement and education. Those are the mandated reporters who are mostly making the referrals or making the calls to the hotline. But then there are other, there's other mandated reporters also calling in, and then non-mandated reporters call in as well if you have concerned families or neighbors. But the vast majority of calls come from mandated reporters. And LA County data, the calls that come in from law enforcement are significantly more likely to be substantiated than the calls that come in from educators. And I think there's a lot of different theories about why that is. So I'm not going to say that we know why, but that's just what the data shows right now. Okay. So what do we do now? So we know we have a problem, or at least we think we have a problem. We have these laws in place that have kind of set up this system. They're meant to be protective of kids. They come from a good place, but we're now seeing that the outcomes that they can have a negative impact on families. And so what do we do now? We have to think about how we can address it. And so what are our different options? So here's the different strategies that we think about internally when we're talking about system change. One is we use the courts. You do individual case advocacy, you do class actions, you do appellate cases. So this is not a law school class. I won't go into this too much, but that's always one option to make system change. But what I mostly work on is more kind of policy reform, macro level reform outside of the court system. And you can do that at the local level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. So first, I'm going to talk about local advocacy because I think we pay way too little attention. This is just a general comment. We pay way too little attention about local advocacy. Most of the things that impact our lives come from local politicians. And Taylor worked, I don't know if everyone knows this, but Taylor worked in local politics and knows a lot about this area and can tell you really how important it is to be following local advocacy. So this is a little quiz for everyone. The first one is, who is the governing body of the County of Los Angeles? Board of Supervisors, awesome. So you guys knew that right away. So we have the LA County Board of Supervisors. And then just take some guesses what our budget was in LA County for the last fiscal year. What do you think we spent in the county? Anyone have any idea? Any brave soul want to make a guess? Except for Taylor. How about up or down? Do we think it's more or less than 5 billion? More. Okay, 10 billion? Yeah, more. Okay. So you guys are on the right track. So here's the answers. So LA County Board of Supervisors, you identified that very quickly. They're a 5-member board. They have option to have 3 4-year terms. So they have can be in their seats for quite a long time. And the budget last year, which went up even more this year, was $36 billion. So that is the budget a lot of states have. It is a lot of authority. They have a lot of authority over a lot of different things. They have oversight over all of the county agencies, like, you know, the mask mandate. That's a big kind of topic you hear people talking about. They oversee Department of Public Health. They oversee school districts. They oversee a lot of things. And so it's very important to be kind of knowledgeable about who your supervisor is and how you can potentially get in contact with them if you have ideas or want to make change. We do a lot of work with the Board of Supervisors, and they do a lot of good in the realm of child welfare. Also, just put this picture up because this is the first time in history that all 5 of the supervisors are women. They used to be called the 5 Little Kings many, many years ago because they're fairly unregulated, not a lot of oversight, have a huge budget to manage, and they were all men for a long time. So back in like the 70s and 80s, they were referred to as the 5 Little Kings. Now we have 5 women. So that's where we are. You can kind of see in this breakdown where most of the money is spent in this very large budget. Public protection, lots of money spent there, lots of money health and sanitation, public assistance, little bit on recreation, but that's kind of the breakdown of our budget. And I should say, I'm not talking a lot about budgets and finances in this conversation, but when you're doing policy reform, it is always part of the conversation. Understanding the budget is critically important because many, many times what we are advocating for is going to cost money. And so you need to know how to make those requests, and that has to be kind of part of your analysis in any strategic analysis. Okay, what is this going to cost? Who's going to be on the hook for it? Can we get their support or their buy-in, or figure out how to make it come from multiple different places so it's not being, you know, all of the obligation isn't being put on one entity. So that's always part of the analysis. I've learned way more about the budget than I ever thought I would doing child welfare, but it's definitely a really important piece of policy advocacy. Okay, state advocacy. So we spend a lot of time in state advocacy as well. There are state policies that get put out by the Department of Social Services. That is the state department that oversees child welfare in California. We also do budget advocacy, which I just talked about, and then we do legislation. So legislation is trying to get a bill trying to get a bill introduced and then helping it get passed and then hoping that the governor signs it and then it becomes law. And so that's a good part of my time is spent on legislative advocacy. Okay, so strategies for advocacy. So where do you begin? I think building a coalition is always important. We talked about our bills around relative placement. So what we did last year was try to change the law so that a relative, regardless of the criminal history, can have a child placed with them. And that had a coalition that I've never worked with before. We had people from the criminal reentry advocacy community. We had parents and grandparents whose families were involved with the child welfare system. We had county agency representatives, so people from DCFS who represented the county agencies. We had a lot of child welfare organizations, and all of us came together to be a coalition to work on this bill. And that sends a really powerful message, right, to legislators. Like, they have all these people from all these different stakeholder groups who aren't always on the same side coming together. You know, having a parent who lost a child to a child welfare system advocating for a bill with a representative from a child welfare agency is a pretty powerful message. So that's, you know, building a coalition is an important piece of advocacy. Have a clear message, create written materials. You can even draft the proposed changes to the law. 100% of the time we come in when we're lobbying to try to find someone to take our bills, we have the law already written for them, which they love, right? It's that much easier for anyone if you already have the law written. but it also makes them understand kind of what we're trying to do. Find your champion. Foster care is one of the few bipartisan issues left. But this is also a strategy thing. You have to think about who's going to be more likely to get a bill through. There are different positions that people hold in the legislature, and some give them kind of more leadership authority than others. And so you want to be strategic, especially if your bill is going to cost a lot of money. Maybe you want to get someone who's on the budget committee or someone who's on the appropriation committee so they can get through those harder committees. What we find often with child welfare bills is everybody's supportive of the policy. So you're not going to have any problem getting through policy committees, but when it gets to budget and fiscal, that's where we have the challenges. Build relationships, meet with policymakers directly. I didn't realize until I did this job how easy it is to meet with a legislator, how easy it is to kind of get your message heard and potentially get a bill through. So don't be afraid to reach out to the offices directly to try to set up meetings, even if you don't have the solution, but you just want them to know about the issue. Explore multiple branches of government, rely on experts and data. So I did a bill with a professor at UCLA. We were working on issues of exploitation, sexual exploitation of kids. For many, many years, prostitution was legal. Prostitution was criminalized for minors. So minors who were trafficked and forced to have sex were also criminalized and sent to the juvenile justice system, which is, it's a form of sexual abuse. And so we worked on legislation to decriminalize prostitution and to make it clear that it's sexual abuse and it belongs in the child welfare system. And so that bill I worked on with researchers from UCLA who were able to come in and offer the research data side of things, which I think, legislators are very used to hearing from advocates and lobbyists, but they're not as used to hearing from researchers who are coming in with a seemingly unbiased opinion and presenting their research. And so that was extremely effective for that bill, which did have some pushback and opposition from DAs and other groups. But we were able to get that through. And I think in large part, it was because of the researchers. Is that professor still at UCLA? She is. It's Elizabeth Barnard, and she's in the she's an MD in the pediatric
Medical school.
unit, Taylor
She's in
Medical
medical
School.
school.
Okay. Yeah, and there's a whole team now, I think, that works on these types of issues. And then use the media. Media is always an effective tool. And I think if you're really struggling to get a message across, it's especially effective because people don't want to read bad things in the news about themselves. Okay, let's see. What I didn't talk about in the corner, which I'm not going to go through today, step by step, is how a bill becomes a law. Because hopefully everybody has seen that little cartoon, How a Bill Becomes a Law. I think it's actually a really effective way to learn about how a bill becomes a law, but I'll just cover the highlights today so you guys understand how it works in case anyone's more interested. So what you do around the end of the year or so in California, everything's on a 2-year legislative cycle, which means a bill gets introduced at the beginning and then has 2 years to get through. You can also introduce a bill in the second year of that cycle, but then you only have 1 year to get it through. So if you're working on a bill that you think is going to be controversial and is going to require some negotiations, and you strategically want to introduce that at the beginning of the 2-year cycle, so you kind of have those 2 years to work it through. So bills are called AB and then they have a number, or SB and they have a number. That stands for Assembly Bill or Senate Bill. And that really just means it was introduced on the Senate side or the Assembly side. So if the legislator is an Assembly member, your bill will have an AB number. If your legislator is a senator, they'll have an SB number. So around the end of the year, the beginning of the next year is when we start shopping bills around. So what that means is we meet with, usually you're meeting with not the legislator themselves, their staff, but sometimes you meet with the legislator themselves, especially if they're really interested in the topic. Like Isaac Bryan, who's an assembly member from LA County, also a former foster youth, used to be a UCLA researcher. He is very involved in foster care, and probably he himself will be the one who's talking to the advocacy groups when they're pitching a bill. But you go in, and you basically tell them your idea. You say, this is, we've identified, I'll use mandated reporting. We've identified this as an issue. We've identified mandated reporting. These are all of the reasons why we think the law needs to change. This is our idea to change it. Would you be the author on our bill? So our advocacy groups can never be authors. Only legislators can be authors. We're considered the sponsors of a bill. So even if we wrote it, we're never going to be the author because we can't introduce it into the legislature. So that's kind of the initial step, is to identify a legislator to introduce your bill and to be the author of the bill. And then the bill gets introduced, and then it gets set for a number of hearings in policy committees that are relevant to the bill. So we will always be in like the Judiciary Committee or the Human Services Committee, because those are the committees that look at bills like ours that impact child welfare. If you're doing a medical bill, it's probably going to go in the Health Committee. There's all sorts of committees on finance and all the things that I don't pay attention to. I should, but really what we usually end up in Judiciary or Human Services, or maybe Public Safety if it's a bill that impacts law enforcement as well. So the bill has to go through those committees, and then it goes through Appropriations, which is a financial committee. Then the entire Senate or the entire Assembly votes on the bill. Then it goes over to the next House. So it goes from Assembly to Senate or Senate to Assembly, and then you repeat the whole process. And then if you get all the way through that, it goes to the governor. So that's kind of how a bill becomes a law. Again, you can watch that little cartoon if you want more details. California is incredibly transparent in the way bills are passed. And this is not the same at the federal level, and it's not the same in a lot of states. So we are very lucky. Everything is online. It's all on a website. I'll put it in the chat. You can look up any bill and you can see all the different amendments that were made on the bill. You can see what happened and which house it's in, what committee it's in. And they give you a way to provide input into the bill. So it's actually a really nice and easy way to be involved in legislation here. I'll stop there in case there's any questions just on that. I know I covered a lot of information. So any questions on that legislative process? Awesome. So you guys are all ready to go and pass bills? Yes, no? Okay. What's
So
the
you
name
have-
of that senator that is a former foster youth? His name is Isaac Bryan, Bryan.
Sue, maybe you could just address like that process and some of the common challenges that come up within it.
Sure. I mean, I would say from the perspective of CLC, I think most of our bills, if they don't make it out of that process, it's because they cost money, and that's really the heart. There's a little saying there's a few sayings I'll teach you in like the policy world. So one is making sausage, and that's what they call kind of getting a bill through that ends up looking very different than the original version. And it's because oftentimes you're negotiating to try to get it through. So you're changing your language up. So sometimes a bill gets out and you're like, what? You're reading it as a lawyer and you're like, what do they mean by this? And why, how did this get written? And oftentimes that's because of negotiations going back and forth. So that's one kind of, people are going to give their input. For us, it's usually around money, but it also can be the child welfare agencies. So every single year. So the way that we do it at CLC is I have a legislation committee. It's made up of lots of our staff, again, who are working on the ground and seeing the problems day to day. And they give me ideas throughout the year or in the beginning of the year. And then we go through all the ideas and figure out which ones we're going to focus on. Every single year since I have been doing this, which is now, I started in 2014 doing policy work. So now I'm in my 8th year. Every year someone says, I want a law that allows us to get a social worker off of a case. And like that just never would get through, because the lobbyists for the child welfare agencies, who are really well known in the Capitol and have a lot of authority, they would oppose it, and it would probably die in the very first committee. So, you're not only are you, and I have a slide on this later, not only are you trying to get a bill through, but you're also trying to make sure that other organizations are going to not oppose it and work with you to get the bill through. There might be some organizations who oppose a bill and the legislature really doesn't care. And so you can get a bill through with that opposition. But if you have opposition from, let's say, a union like SEIU, who represent the social workers in LA County, or CWDA, who represent all the child welfare agencies, you're going to have a lot of time. You can have a really tough time getting it through without negotiating the language with those organizations. So that is a lot of what our time is spent on. We introduce our like big wish at the beginning, and then we work with organizations to try to move it through the process to get it to a point where everyone's okay with. And then after it gets through all of the legislature, all of those committees, all of the members vote on it, it goes to the governor to be signed. And every once in a while, our bills get vetoed, not often, but there are some situations where the legislature might pass something, but they might not have funding for it in the budget. And the governor says, sorry, there's no money for that, and vetoes the bill. Or the governor thinks the issue is already resolved and vetoes the bill. So every once in a while we get a veto as well. Any other questions on that? Let me check the chat. The chat disappeared. Okay. All right. So moving on. Talked about that already. So we kind of going back to our mandated reporting. So now we have to think about strategy and how are we going, what are we going to do to change either the law or policy to address some of the issues we're seeing with mandated reporting. So this came from New York, who see similar problems with mandated reporting that we do. So a lot of their advocacy groups, and this actually stemmed from an advocacy group that's parents who are involved in child welfare system. They have a very active group of parents there, and they work on a lot of different bills. So they came up with an idea to have an Anti-Harassment and Reporting Act. And in New York, you can make a report of abuse or neglect that can be totally anonymous. So there really is no consequence at all for the reporter. And so their goal was to try to create law that says you can't make an anonymous report of abuse or neglect, that you have to provide your name and contact information. And I took this little clip from the article on the right, which there's a link to when Taylor sends it out. And you can see that this bill didn't get through. They were working on this last year or this year actually. And the legislators, they didn't end up getting it passed. So that was one attempt at addressing some of the issues we see with mandated reporting in New York, and that did not get through, but I think they're going to try again. And then this is what we're doing in California, and this is a bill that CLC is sponsoring. We're working with an assembly member, Chris Holden, who's also from LA County. And what the bill is seeking to do is addressing some of the over surveillance and over representation of families of color in the child welfare system by reforming the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, which you guys read a lot of that law at the beginning with me. So this is our fact sheet. So this is what goes along with every bill. You have a fact sheet that looks like this, that has a summary of the law and a background and then a solution. And so this is what we use to try to lobby the bill and get it through committees, and also to convince other people to join us in supporting the bill, or to respond to people who are wondering why we're doing the bill. And what specifically are we proposing? So there's a few different sections we're proposing to amend, but this is kind of the changes to the general neglect language that we read in the beginning, and everything in blue would be added. So you remember what the current law says is general neglect means the failure of a person having the care or custody of a child to provide adequate food, clothing, blah, 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 where no physical injury to the child has occurred. So we would add, but the child is at substantial risk of suffering serious physical harm or illness. And then we would specify general neglect does not include a parent's economic disadvantage. So that is our proposal right now to change the code in that law. And we are at the very end of the process. So we have made it through, this was introduced by an assembly member, so we made it through the assembly, and now we are on the Senate side, and we made it through the policy committees, and now the bill is in appropriations right now. So if it gets out of appropriations, then it's to the full Senate for a vote, and then it'll go to the governor for his signature. So that's kind of where we are with this bill. So if all goes well, this would be the law next year, which I think doesn't solve all the problems, but at least it is a definition of neglect that is more closely in line with what the definition of neglect is in our statutes for jurisdiction of a child to come into the child welfare system. So rather than having this kind of broad, any child who doesn't have adequate shelter, clothing, or food is at risk, there's, you know, this more tailored definition that says that child actually has to be at risk of serious physical harm or illness because of the lack of access to adequate food, shelter, clothing, etc. So I'll stop here. Any questions on this? Do you like this? Do you think it's going to change the law? Would love to hear anyone's thoughts or reactions.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I know, and it does say does not include parents' economic disadvantage. So if a parent is unable to provide, using the terminology at the beginning, adequate, you know, all these things that children need, then is there a solution on how to help parents to provide those needs? Because the way that I see it is if unfortunately, because of how economically disadvantaged they could be, children could be exposed to being at risk, right, of suffering.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. Like,
It does make sense. No, it does make sense. And it's something like we had, so our original version of the language had more about giving mandated reporters information about how to help the family so that they're not feeling like their only option is to call in a report. But that didn't make it into this, you know, where we are now with the language. So I think that's a really important topic of conversation is, okay, so if there is a family who needs help and the child isn't getting adequate food, clothing, shelter, what happens next? Is it the obligation of the mandated reporter to you know, link them up to all these services? Is it the obligation of the child welfare system? So I think there's still some, you know, some more areas that we need to address. Our take on this bill is if there's a child who's not being fed and the child is at serious risk of physical illness because they're not being fed, that would fall under this criteria of a report. Unless the mandated reporter is able to help them get access, and then they don't have to make a report.
So then, I'm sorry. So then I guess the fine line, it's whether it's intentional or not, and then who would it? I guess like it would just be reporting, and then someone makes that determination, right? Whether it's intentional or maybe it's just because of lack of resources.
I think the line is also whether the child's at substantial risk of serious harm.
Right.
Because a child coming into school every day wearing the wrong size clothes because their family can't afford different clothing, that doesn't put the child at substantial risk of suffering serious physical harm or illness.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, but
Okay.
you know, I think there is still some gray, and that kind of goes back to the making sausage, because we really did want some language in here that talked about if the parents at an economic disadvantage, what are the options of the mandated reporter to try to help them to get out of the situation if the situation is causing substantial risk of serious physical harm or illness. So I think there's more to be done on this, and thank you for the feedback. Because I think what our hope is that this would limit the calls to really serious issues of neglect where the child's at imminent risk of harm, not issues of poverty where the child is not at imminent risk of harm. Any other thoughts or comments, criticisms of the language? All of it is welcome.
Hi, my name is Marcos. Just want to kind of look at the word substantial. I think that's really could be open to interpretation at times. It can be a slippery slope if you're thinking of something being substantial in the moment or substantial through the development of a child. And we've talked about ACEs before, how something so minimal can be a dramatic experience for a child. addition, we focus a lot on physical harm, but there's also mental health, mental illness that might be overlooked by not having more inclusive language on that. So that's something
Yeah.
too.
Yeah,
So,
and that's, just to respond on that, there is a section on emotional, I forgot what the term is. Let's go back and see in that big list. Emotional abuse. So there still is another definition of emotional abuse outside of this idea of neglect. But I do think that's an important point. And the point about substantial is really important because even adequate, like those are words that are, they're really, ambiguous terms that I might think adequate food means something very different than someone else, right? I might think, adequate medical care means that you need to get your child vaccinated. And someone else might think that that is inadequate medical care, right? So a lot of these are really subjective. And that's, I think it's really hard to write a law that isn't subjective. But with something like this, where it can have such an impact on a family, we try to make it as non-objective as we can, but of course, not subjective as we can, but of course, it's really hard to do that. The substantial risk of serious physical harm or illness comes from current law. And that's something I really like to do in my drafting of potential language changes is I like to use terms or phrases that are in existing law that have already been interpreted by the courts. So it's not something we're making up, it's something that people understand. So substantial definitely is one of those words that's ambiguous, but there is some guidance in case law on what it means for a child to be at risk of suffering serious physical harm or illness. But adequate to me is another one of those words. Like, what does adequate mean? Especially when it says where no physical injury to the child has occurred. So that really opens up a real wide, broad spectrum of things that can be reported. Any other thoughts? Thank you for the feedback. It's really helpful. And we are still, this is not going to be our last bill on mandated reporting. We are still we want to tackle the training and the inconsistency in the training next year. And there are some other thoughts that people have on how mandated reporting could be, improved in the state. And so I will take your feedback to the group that's looking at mandated reporting. There's also, I talked about local policy. There's also a local group within LA County that includes DCFS, the Child Welfare Agency, that's looking at mandated reporting in LA County and how we might be able to change policies in LA County to improve the way mandated reporting works. Okay. So these are all of our sponsored bills. Just so you get an idea of what we're working on in addition to what I talked about with mandated reporting. So we have a bill that would inform attorneys anytime there's a disciplinary action taken against one of their clients. Right now, we get informed if there's a disciplinary action taken by the district, but we don't get informed if there's a disciplinary action taken at the school level. And there was some research that came out. This is another example of us using research. There's some research that came out that Black boys, and especially Black boys in foster care, are significantly more likely to be suspended than any other group of students. And in the age of those suspensions are very young, 7 and 8 year olds. And so, multiple suspensions have a big implication on education, on housing stability also, because there are caregivers who they just can't keep taking off of work. And we see a lot of placements disrupt because of constant suspensions. And it's not trauma informed. Lots of times these youth are going through a lot. They've been separated from their families. There's a lot of trauma in their history. And so this would just give us notice so that we can intervene when we find out that our client is being suspended a lot, and try to intervene and help resolve the problem, make sure they're getting the right services and supports. So that's one of our bills. We're also working on a bill that would require the Child Welfare Agency to translate any court report into our client's native language. I was shocked to find out that we don't have that requirement almost every other field in the law has requirements, like if a child's disabled and they get regional center services, their family needs to get their information in their native language, but in child welfare, we don't. So our clients are getting reports and they're being asked to sign things that they don't understand and they can't read. So this is a pretty simple bill, would require to translate, but this did not make it into the budget. We were also doing budget advocacy. And so this is one of those bills that might not get through, might get vetoed because we don't have money for it, which is really crazy considering how big our budget is in California. We have a bill that would strengthen family connections for adopted children. So, you know, with all of this kind of explosion of all these companies that look at your, you know, you send in your fingerprint, and they tell you all this stuff about your background, but lots of times our clients who are adopted have a lot of trouble connecting to their biological families. And so this would strengthen family connections for our clients who are adopted. It would also strengthen the laws around post-adoption contact between siblings who are not adopted together. And so that is a bill that we are working on that I think is so far has been going through okay. I don't know that there's been much opposition to that bill, and there's not a big cost to it. I talked about our AB 2085 around mandated reporting. We have a bill that would allow foster care to go beyond 21 if the child welfare agency doesn't do what they're required to do by the time our client reaches age 21. So right now there's all these things the child welfare agency has to do, like provide our clients with birth certificates or social security cards or medical information. And they need to have a housing plan before they exit foster care. And lots of times we reach age 21 with our clients and those things haven't been done. And the court says, there's nothing I could do because our client's 21 and the law says we can only keep a case open until they're 21, and they close the case. And I don't know if any of the prior speakers talked about the outcomes for youth who exit foster care, but they're pretty abysmal. A huge percentage of youth end up being homeless. And so this bill is really meant to make sure that our clients have everything they need before they exit foster care so that we're not kind of continuing that foster care to homeless pipeline. And then our last bill is around blind removal, which Taylor, I don't know if you've talked about blind removal already, so I don't need to repeat it a little bit. It's something that the Pritzker Center has been very involved with. So I don't know if you want to jump in, Taylor, anything to contribute to this. And it's okay if you say no.
Oh, David mentioned it briefly during his talk.
Okay.
And I think that's the extent of, you know, how much we've talked about it. Certainly our students that, you know, work at the Pritzker Center also know about blind removal, but we haven't talked about it that much.
So Nassau County did a pilot project many years ago where they had one social worker go out and investigate an allegation of abuse or neglect, write up a report, and then redact any information that would reveal that family's race. And then they had another group of social workers look at the report and make a decision about whether or not to separate the family. And they found over 5 years of 50% reduction in the separation of Black children. And so lots of promise in addressing some of the bias that comes in that decision to separate a family. And so we've been talking a lot about trying pilots in California and have been, up to this point, not successful in getting the agencies to do those pilots. I know that Taylor was very involved in a motion that LA County did requiring a pilot here, and that pilot is in the process of being established and I think has started or is near starting.
Lifting off next week.
Lifting off next week. So this is very timely. And so our bill would just enable 3 counties to also do pilots. So it would create a funding stream at the state level for 3 counties to say like, hey, we also want to pilot blind removal, and they could draw down some of those dollars to pilot it in their counties. So that is the goal of that bill. That is a 2-year bill. We got a lot of opposition from SEIU, the union that represents the social workers. And one of the reasons is they said in Nassau County, most of the social workers were white, whereas in LA County, most of the social workers are not white. And so it probably won't, you know, be as big of a benefit here because people who aren't white don't have the same bias, which we know from lots of data isn't true. And also, we don't know it until we try it. And that's always been our argument. We're really just talking about piloting it. So we will see if that bill gets through. That hasn't been an easy one, but it's now in the last committee. So we're really hoping it does get through. Any questions on our bills or any thoughts? Oh, I think we had one question in the chat. Regarding AB 2189, would this also extend the youth benefit? It would extend the benefit. It specifically says if the court keeps jurisdiction open past 21, the youth continues to get their benefits. And that's where we're getting the major pushback of, well, this is going to be a really costly bill. This is going to be tens of millions of dollars is what we heard from the child welfare agencies. And so our response is, okay, so you're saying that you're not doing your job on basically every case. If you think it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars for the court to keep the case open only in situations where you haven't done your job. So that is our response, but we do have that problem of them saying this is going to be a really costly bill. And so we're not sure if it'll get out of the finance committee, but we'll know in a few weeks. Is there anything I can do to support these efforts? Yes. So there's lots of ways you can support legislation. So these are not in policy committees anymore, but you can testify in support of bills. You can be a witness in support of bills, and then you can also write letters. And a letter has to be a week before the hearing date. And all of it, like I said, is very easy. I will put at the end of this, I will put our website, or I'll put it in right now. Because I'm sharing my screen, for some reason, I'm having trouble like going to regular. So maybe Taylor, you can add in the CLC website page on legislation.
You got it.
Also the California Leg Info page that lets you track legislation and sign up and follow and submit support letters and all of that. If you know that one. And if not, I could do that at the end when I stop sharing. Okay, so implementation. I mentioned this already at the beginning, but I can't say it enough. It's a key piece to any reform effort. We have lots and lots and lots of bills that get passed every year, so many laws. Just to give you an idea, like AB 2089 means 2,089 bills were introduced before that bill in 1 year. So we have lots and lots of legislation that gets passed. And so we really like where we miss the mark often is implementation and making sure that what's passed in law gets implemented on the ground. And lots of times these bills require change in culture. They require big shifts in practice. And so I'm always advocating for people to really pay attention to implementation. Once you've passed a bill, go around the state and do trainings, just figure out how to get the word out so that everything, so that things actually change on the ground. So that's just a plug, if any of you become policymakers, to make sure implementation is part of your practice. And then playing defense. This is, I think, one of the more important pieces of our job. So I just said thousands of pieces of legislation get introduced every year. We track the bills that relate to child welfare. So they're usually around foster care, but there's also bills in the education arena or in the juvenile justice arena that impact our clients. And so we follow and track at least 100 bills a year. And that's a lot of work. And the bills change, right? The language changes along the way. So you have to be very careful about making sure you're reading every amendment and you're thinking about unintended consequences. Usually in foster care, these bills come from a good place, but people just might not think about the unintended consequences of a particular piece of legislation. And this bill that we wrote in opposition to has to do with mandated reporting, since we're on that theme. So this bill wanted to add more people to the list of mandated reporters. And again, we're just right now on heightened awareness of the fact that that growing list and the obligations on mandated reporting has had some negative impact on families and the system generally, because of they're just inundated with all of these reports. And so we wrote an oppose less amended, and we offered specific amendments, which they did accept, and then we withdrew our opposition. But that's a way to also engage in legislative advocacy. It's not just your own ideas, and pushing your own ideas. It's also about watching other people's ideas and weighing in. And that could mean supporting, like someone said, how do I support? That's legislative advocacy also. You might not be the one who sponsored it or created it, but you want to testify and you want to join the coalition, and that's great. And lots of times that's what we're doing. We're tracking bills and we're weighing in support, but then we're also sometimes looking at bills and saying, like, I don't think this would be best for our clients. And so, you can start with a less aggressive position, like you're calling the office and you're saying, hey, you guys have this bill. We represent all the kids in the child welfare system in LA County. We're really worried about this bill doing X, Y, or Z. Would you guys consider it amending in this way? And lots of times that's what happens. You're negotiating and they make the changes and you don't have to do a formal opposition. But if you've continued to try to get them to get on board and you're not going anywhere, or if the bill is just so outrageous that you're like, no way are we ever going to support this? Like, we've had some bills come up that would have denied our clients access to certain reproductive health rights, things like that, where we're just out the gate, like, okay, we are opposing this. We are not going to let this get through. Then you write a letter of opposition to the committee, which gives you an opportunity to testify in the committee about why you're opposing. And oftentimes that can be a way to stop a bill. That is not the link, but I will put in the link. And I don't know what that link is to, but it's probably a really helpful website since it says advocates. So what I was referring to is, you can Google Ledge Info California, and it'll take you to the website that tracks all of the bills and tells you what committee they're in and when they're going to be heard. And then you can go to that committee and you can create a login, and then you can track certain bills and you can submit letters in support or opposition. And I'll put it in right when we stop sharing. I think I'm almost at the end of this. Federal advocacy. So federal advocacy is also important. And the way federal advocacy really plays out, or the way federal law really plays out in child welfare, is through money. So we don't necessarily need to comply with federal law, but if we don't, we can't draw down federal dollars. And so that's the way that federal advocacy works. And an example is, for many, many, many years, the way that you drew down federal dollars for foster care is by separating a family. So it required, in order to draw down federal dollars to serve a family, you had to separate the family. The child had to be in foster care. But there's been a kind of a shift in thinking about how we're really serving families and whether it's best to separate a family, and lots of emphasis on prevention as a strategy in child welfare. And so a couple of years ago, the feds changed the law to also allow states to draw down money for prevention services if a child's at imminent risk of foster care. So that was kind of a landmark change in the law, and probably is going to trickle down in changes in states, because they can now draw down federal dollars without separating a family. So that's kind of the way federal advocacy works. It's something CLC would like to be more a part of, but like I said, it's not as transparent as California law. It's very hard to know where something is, what committee it's in. It's not on a website like it is here. So unless you're in DC and walking the halls of the Capitol, it's, you're kind of just trying to figure it out from afar. So we're not super involved in federal law, but we do get involved when it's very specific to child welfare. And I certainly encourage other people to get involved if you are interested. And that's it. This is my contact information. I'm always happy to talk more about my job or ideas you might have.